In the frozen silence of a northern riverbank, a flag was raised, and with it, a dream of empire. But this was no Spanish conquest. This was French Canada. And in these forests, survival depended not on muskets or missions, but on furs, alliances, and an unforgiving land. Before there was Quebec, there was a hunger, not for land, not even for conquest, but for prestige. For France in the late 16th century, the New World was a stage, and Spain had stolen the spotlight. While the Spanish filled ships with gold and silver, the English laid claim to scattered colonies. France, the most refined power in Europe, watched from the sidelines, divided by wars of religion and distracted by dynastic drama. But empires wait for no one. By 1600, the time had come. A new generation of French thinkers, traders, and politicians began looking westward once more. They weren't dreaming of Aztec treasures or Caribbean sugar. Their sights were set on something colder, more complex, and infinitely more enduring: the vast forests and frozen rivers of the north. There, they believed, lay France's future. And it began with the oldest of obsessions: a passage. The fabled Northwest Passage, a mythical sea route through North America to the riches of Asia, had seduced explorers for decades. The Spanish looked south. The English hugged the eastern coast. But the French, they gambled on the St. Lawrence River, a massive artery that cut deep into the heart of the continent. It was a highway of hope, slicing through pine and rock toward an unknown inland sea. And so, in 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the mouth of the St. Lawrence. His arrival was no gentle landing. A cross was erected, land was claimed, and the people who had lived there for thousands of years, the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, were labeled subjects of the King of France. But the dream ended quickly. Cartier returned twice, but his expeditions yielded little beyond maps and frostbite. His attempt to establish a permanent colony failed. The site, Charlesbourg Royal, was abandoned, and France turned away. For nearly 60 years, the northern wilderness was left to trappers, fishermen, and memory. But silence doesn't mean surrender. In 1598, King Henry IV of France, newly crowned and eager to unify a war-torn country, granted monopolies to merchants willing to risk colonization. They would bring back furs, they would claim land, and they would spread the Catholic faith, a holy trinity of prophet, power, and piety. The man who would give this vision flesh and bone was Samuel de Champlain. Champlain was not a conqueror. He was not a noble. He was a map maker, a man of method and measure. He combined the curiosity of a scientist with the diplomacy of a courtier. His journeys along the St. Lawrence in the early 1600s were cautious, calculated, and deeply respectful of the native nations he encountered. He understood, more than most Europeans, that no colony in this land would survive without alliances. By 1603, Champlain had begun building those relationships with the Montagnais, with the Algonquin, with the Huron, not with violence, but with gifts, not with swords, but with skin, beaver pelts, soft gold in Europe, traded hand over hand. France wasn't simply planting a flag, it was entering a network. Still, the dream of an empire required more than trade routes. It needed permanence. In 1608, Champlain would sail again. This time, not to map or meet, but to build. He chose a steep, rocky outcrop along the St. Lawrence as the site for a new settlement. It would be named Quebec, from the Algonquin word meaning where the river narrows, a place of natural defense, of convergence, of destiny. But that story, the founding of Quebec, belongs to the next chapter. For now, what matters is this: the arrival of France in the New World was not an accident of tides or winds. It was deliberate, strategic, and utterly different from the conquests of Spain or the speculation of England. The French came not as crusaders or cash-hungry pirates, but as traders, cartographers, priests, and opportunists, ready to weave their fate into the fabric of an unfamiliar land. The forests of North America would not echo with the clash of steel just yet. They would rustle instead with quiet negotiations, cautious footsteps, and the soft hiss of canoes cutting across black water. The dream of a northern empire had begun, and it would be written not in gold, but in snow, fur, and fragile alliances. By the time the 17th century dawned, France had not yet carved a meaningful presence in the New World. Though Jacques Cartier's 16th century expeditions gave France a foothold in claiming territory, they left behind more maps than colonies. His 3 voyages in the 1530s and 1540s were filled with promise. He sailed up the St. Lawrence River, encountered the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, and even wintered in what would become Quebec. But attempts to build a permanent settlement failed miserably. Harsh winters, scurvy, and tense relations with indigenous groups shattered French hopes for a northern empire, at least for a time. For nearly half a century after Cartier, France turned inward. Religious civil wars consumed the country, and while Spain and Portugal enriched themselves with silver and sugar in the south, France's grand ambitions for the north dimmed. But the land Cartier had charted still held its grip on the French imagination. Fishers from Brittany and Normandy quietly continued to work the waters off Newfoundland, bringing tales of rich furs and navigable rivers. These whispers reached the ears of explorers and merchants alike. And with the end of religious wars, France looked outward once more. It was Samuel de Champlain who would rekindle the dream. Born in Brouage, a port town on France's Atlantic coast, Champlain had grown up with salt in his veins and maps in his mind. By the late 1590s, he had already traveled to the West Indies and Central America, observing Spanish colonies and dreaming of what France might achieve if it followed a different path, one not rooted in conquest and gold, but trade and alliance. In 1603, Champlain joined a reconnaissance voyage to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, led by François Gravé Dupont, a French merchant with a royal fur trading monopoly, sponsored the mission. While Dupont focused on commerce, Champlain took detailed notes, mapping the St. Lawrence and establishing contact with local indigenous nations, particularly the Montagnais. Unlike the Spanish conquistadors, or even Cartier before him, Champlain saw indigenous peoples not as obstacles or enemies, but as potential partners. When he returned to France, Champlain pushed for more than just trade. He wanted to build something lasting, an outpost that could serve as a base for fur trading, missionary work, and exploration. And he knew just the place, a narrow point on the St. Lawrence River where the cliffs offered protection and the waters ran deep enough for anchorage. The site had once been home to an Iroquoian village called Stadacona, which Cartier encountered decades earlier. Champlain would name it Quebec, an Algonquin word meaning where the river narrows. In 1608, Champlain returned with settlers, builders, and supplies. It was not a large group, just a few dozen men, but it was enough to lay the foundations of what would become Quebec City. The early days were brutal. Disease, bitter cold, and inadequate shelter took a heavy toll, and by the time spring arrived, only a handful of the original settlers had survived. But Champlain endured. He believed deeply in the mission, not for gold or glory, but for the vision of a new France that could stand alongside its indigenous allies, share the bounty of the fur trade, and act as a gateway to the continent's riches. He forged key alliances with the Montagnais, the Algonquin, and later the Huron-Wendat. These were not merely trade partnerships. They were military alliances that would shape the geopolitics of the region for decades. In return for access to French goods and firearms, indigenous allies supported French expansion and joined in campaigns against mutual enemies, particularly the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois. Champlain's presence in the New World was a gamble for France. It lacked the workforce, the ships, and the wealth of its Iberian rivals. But what France did have was vision. Champlain laid the groundwork for a different kind of colony. Not a replica of Spanish conquest, but something more entangled, more cooperative, and more precarious. He documented everything: the rivers, the flora, the customs of the tribes, and the politics between nations. He sketched out a vision for what New France could become, which would guide explorers and settlers long after his death. Still, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Champlain's alliances pulled France into indigenous conflicts. His decision to join a war party against the Iroquois in 1609 would have far-reaching consequences, igniting a conflict that would burn for generations. Yet, from Champlain's perspective, it was a necessary price for building trust and surviving. By the time Champlain returned to France in 1610 to secure more support, he had accomplished what Cartier could not. He had planted a foothold on the continent. He had earned the trust of native nations, and he had shown that New France was not just a dream, it was a reality in the making. In the frozen breath of the Canadian wilderness, empires were not built with gold, but with fur. More than any mineral or crop, the soft pelts of the beaver became the engine of French ambition in North America. By the early 1600s, fur had transformed from a fashion item to a source of fortune. And in the forests and riverways of New France, it became the bridge and the battlefield between indigenous nations and the French colonists. Europe's obsession with fur, especially beaver pelts, was a product of style and practicality. In France and England, felt hats made from beaver underfur became symbols of refinement. But European beavers were nearly extinct by the 1600s. The New World, by contrast, was overflowing with them. The rivers of the St. Lawrence Basin, the Great Lakes, and beyond were prime habitats. A single pelt, adequately prepared, could fetch a small fortune in European markets. And so began the Great Northern Trade. The French were not hunters. They had no experience in trapping beavers or navigating the dense forests. Instead, they relied almost entirely on indigenous nations who had lived in these lands for millennia. For them, hunting was already a part of survival. But now, with iron tools, woolen cloth, and firearms on offer in return, trapping took on new meaning. The Huron-Wendat Confederacy became one of France's most vital trade partners. Settled near modern-day Ontario, the Huron were well-positioned as middlemen. They had existing networks with Algonquin-speaking nations further north and west, and they brought thousands of pelts each season to trading posts like Tadoussac and later Trois-Rivières and Montreal. In exchange, they received iron axes, copper kettles, glass beads, and, most significantly, muskets. This was not a simple barter system. It was a political economy. Trade was tied to alliances. Shared rituals, ceremonies, and gift-giving became essential to maintaining trust. For the Huron and their allies, these exchanges were not just economic, they were spiritual and diplomatic acts. To violate a trade agreement was to risk war. And war, increasingly, was becoming inevitable. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known as the Iroquois to the French, posed the most significant threat. Centered in what is now upstate New York, the Iroquois nations had their own ambitions. Their lands were becoming depleted of beaver, and they eyed the Huron-controlled trade routes jealously. What followed was a brutal series of conflicts known as the Beaver Wars, a contest not just for territory, but for dominance in a rapidly shifting economic world. Firearms escalated the conflict. The Dutch, rivals of the French, supplied guns to the Iroquois through their post at Fort Orange, present-day Albany. The French, in contrast, were reluctant at first to arm their indigenous allies. But as attacks increased and Huron losses mounted, the calculus changed. By the mid-1600s, the fur trade had become inseparable from warfare. Still, within the chaos was collaboration. French traders, known as Coureurs de Bois, runners of the woods, ventured deep into the interior, living among indigenous communities, learning their languages, marrying into their societies, and building trust. Many of these young men abandoned the rigid structure of French settlements, finding freedom and prosperity in native life. Their children, Métis, of mixed French and indigenous ancestry, would later form a cultural bridge between worlds. Champlain and his successors understood that survival in New France required more than just trade. It required understanding. Missionaries, especially the Jesuits, played a key role in this cultural exchange, documenting languages, observing customs, and attempting to convert native peoples to Christianity. While their religious mission often clashed with indigenous spirituality, the Jesuits' journals became invaluable records of early indigenous life and thought. The fur trade reshaped everything. Indigenous economies shifted toward trapping and trade. The influx of European goods magnified ancient rivalries. Seasonal rhythms were altered. Some communities prospered, others fractured under the pressure. Diseases introduced by Europeans ravaged entire nations, with smallpox outbreaks killing thousands. And yet, through it all, native peoples adapted, resisted, and redefined the very fabric of empire. For the French crown, the fur trade was a lifeline. Unlike the silver mines of Peru or the sugar plantations of Brazil, New France produced no immediate mineral wealth, but furs sustained it, financially and diplomatically. They gave France a stake in North America and an excuse to expand deeper into the continent. But furs were a double-edged sword. As more pelts were harvested, beaver populations began to decline. Traders pushed further inland. Conflicts escalated. The French became entangled in wars they only partially understood. And slowly, the dream of a peaceful, cooperative New France began to crack under the weight of empire. Still, in these early decades, the fur trade remained the beating heart of New France. It was not a story of French dominance, but of mutual dependence. The French needed indigenous knowledge and networks, and indigenous nations, in turn, used the French presence to their own advantage, to gain power, resources, and leverage against their enemies. The rivers flowed with more than water. They carried beaver pelts, copper kettles, gunpowder, and alliances. They had promises and the seeds of betrayal. In the North American wilderness, an empire was not built on stone, but on fur. In 1608, on a narrow point overlooking the mighty St. Lawrence River, Samuel de Champlain planted the stakes of a wooden fort. Around it, he built the settlement that would become Quebec, the name drawn from the Algonquin word Quebec, meaning where the river narrows, reflected both the geography and the peril of this new colony. For all its promise, Quebec was not a city. It was a gamble. The first winters were brutal. Snow fell early. The cold pierced through every wall, and food supplies dwindled before the thaw. The winter of 1609 to 1610 claimed many lives. Scurvy, malnutrition, and infection tore through the settlers. Of the 28 men who had come with Champlain, only one survived that first winter. These weren't soldiers or aristocrats. They were carpenters, sailors, artisans, none prepared for Arctic-level conditions. But Champlain endured. He was not merely a leader, he was a diplomat, a cartographer, and a man obsessed with the dream of a French empire rooted in cooperation, not conquest. He understood that the key to survival was not fortification, but relationship, especially with the Montagnais, Algonquin, and Huron peoples. These nations provided not only furs, but food, knowledge of the land, and, crucially, protection. Champlain entered into alliances, and those alliances meant obligations. In 1609, he joined his indigenous allies in a campaign against the Iroquois. Armed with an arquebus, a primitive firearm, Champlain killed 2 Iroquois chiefs in a single shot. The act stunned the Iroquois, who had never seen such a weapon. But the consequences would ripple for decades. This moment of allegiance made the French permanent enemies of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and it ignited a war that would shape the region's future. Back in Quebec, survival was a daily struggle. Supplies from France were infrequent and unreliable. The terrain was unforgiving, and yet, slowly, life began to take shape. Fields were cleared. Crops, wheat, barley, and peas were planted. Small wooden homes dotted the landscape. The settlement remained fragile, but it was no longer just a fort. It was a foothold. To strengthen the colony, Champlain advocated for permanent migration. He argued that New France would never thrive if it were treated only as a trading outpost. It needed farmers, families, and faith. But convincing settlers to leave the comforts of France for a frozen wilderness was no easy task. Many who did come were indentured servants, promised land or wages in exchange for years of hard labor. Life was harsh, but opportunity existed if one survived long enough to claim it. Religious missions became central to Quebec's early identity. The Recollets, and later the Jesuits, arrived with a dual mission: to support the colony and to convert the native peoples. While the Jesuits lived among indigenous communities, learned their languages, and recorded their stories, their spiritual mission clashed with indigenous worldviews. Still, they documented everything: rituals, customs, conflicts, and their journals became some of the richest records of 17th century life in North America. But Quebec was more than a settlement. It was a symbol, a sign that France was not retreating from the continent, even as the English built Jamestown to the south and the Dutch fortified New Amsterdam. The French saw Quebec as the heart of an empire, stretching from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes and beyond. Defending it would be another challenge. In 1627, Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to King Louis XIII, reorganized French efforts in North America. He created the Company of 100 Associates, a trading and colonization enterprise tasked with bringing thousands of settlers to New France. Their monopoly on the fur trade was supposed to fund colonial growth, but from the start, the company struggled. The English intercepted supply ships. Wars in Europe drained resources. The company's grand ambitions faltered under pressure. In 1629, disaster struck. An English fleet led by the Kirke brothers, backed by a rival French faction, captured Quebec. Champlain was forced to surrender. For 3 years, Quebec flew an English flag. But in 1632, under the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France regained control. Champlain returned, older and more cautious, yet still committed to his vision. The colony resumed its slow growth. More settlers arrived. The fur trade expanded westward. Religious missions intensified. And by the time of Champlain's death in 1635, Quebec had become more than a trading post. It was the beating heart of New France. Still, beneath the surface, tensions brewed. The fragile peace with indigenous allies was strained by disease, cultural misunderstanding, and the constant pull of European rivalries. The Iroquois Confederacy, emboldened and armed by the Dutch and later the English, began raiding deep into French territory. Quebec, for all its resilience, remained vulnerable. But its foundations, built on diplomacy, survival, and persistence, would endure. Quebec was not born of glory or conquest. It was born of endurance. In the face of cold, war, famine, and loss, the settlers of New France clung to the river's edge, refusing to be swept away. And in doing so, they planted the seed of a French presence that would outlast kings and empires. In the wilderness of New France, where rivers served as highways and forests as homes, a new kind of mission was taking shape. One not just of exploration or trade, but of salvation. The Jesuits, members of the Society of Jesus, arrived in the early 1630s with a singular purpose: to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. But this mission would lead to profound misunderstandings, resistance, and cultural fractures that reshaped the fate of Native and French societies alike. The Jesuits were not typical priests. Trained in rhetoric, science, and philosophy, they were educated, disciplined, and fiercely devoted. Their vow demanded obedience and endurance, and they lived it, traveling thousands of miles by canoe, enduring bitter winters, eating unfamiliar foods, and living in remote Huron, Algonquin, and Montagnais villages. Their goal was not only to preach, but also to immerse themselves, to learn indigenous languages, document oral traditions, and slowly introduce Christian doctrine through everyday life. They wrote thousands of pages detailing their experiences. These Jesuit relations, published annually in France, became a window into the so-called New World. French readers consumed tales of snowy forests, wild beasts, and savage customs. The priests described sweat lodges, animist rituals, burial ceremonies, and tobacco offerings, sometimes with fascination, other times with horror. To the Jesuits, indigenous religion was idolatry wrapped in nature. Spirits lived in rivers, rocks, animals, and dreams. The idea that a beaver could possess power, or that dreams could guide real-world decisions, clashed with Christian doctrines of a single, omnipotent God. And yet, the priests understood they could not convert with brute force. Instead, they built trust, treating the sick, helping hunt, and sharing in tribal councils. Some indigenous leaders were intrigued. The Jesuits offered new medicines, new tools, and spoke of eternal life. In times of plague and suffering, especially during the deadly smallpox and influenza epidemics of the 1630s and 1640s, some communities saw the missionaries as healers or powerful allies. Others saw them as a curse. Disease often followed in their wake. In many villages, people whispered that the black-robed men had brought death with them. In some cases, Jesuits were expelled or even killed. Conversion was never just theological. It was cultural. To become Christian, one had to abandon sacred rituals, sever ties with ancestral spirits, and accept European gender roles and moral codes. For many, this meant relinquishing deep parts of their identity. Men were expected to adopt farming over hunting. Women were expected to conform to European ideas of modesty, marriage, and motherhood. These expectations disrupted the fabric of indigenous life. Even those who converted lived between two worlds. Some took Christian names but kept traditional beliefs. Others formed Christian enclaves, like the Huron Christian villages near Quebec, which often became targets of conflict. The French hoped that Christian natives would become model citizens of the colony. Still, most walked a delicate line, embracing new tools and knowledge while preserving their own cosmologies in secret. At times, the Jesuits were caught in violent political storms. In the 1640s, tensions between the Huron and the Iroquois exploded into full-blown war. The Jesuits, closely tied to the Huron, became targets. Several priests, Jean de Brébeuf, Gabriel Lalemant, and others, were captured, tortured, and killed by Iroquois warriors. Their deaths shocked France. They were hailed as martyrs, and their suffering became propaganda, fueling support for the colonial mission and justifying deeper French involvement in native wars. But not all indigenous resistance was violent. Some resisted with words, others with silence. Still others played the French and Jesuits against English or Dutch traders, using religion as a diplomatic tool rather than a matter of faith. Across the forests and lakes, indigenous peoples strategized, adapted, and survived, not as passive subjects of mission work, but as active participants in shaping their futures. For the French, the Jesuit project was both a spiritual mission and a colonial strategy. Christianized indigenous communities were seen as buffers against English expansion, as potential allies in war, and as labor sources for the fur trade. But the conversion numbers never met expectations. Despite decades of work, most indigenous people retained their own beliefs or mixed Christianity with traditional religion. The Jesuits themselves faced inner contradictions. They wanted to protect indigenous souls, but often participated in colonial systems that eroded indigenous sovereignty. They argued for the humane treatment of converts, yet celebrated martyrdom and viewed traditional ways as demonic. Their writings, while detailed and often sympathetic, still reflected the lens of European superiority and Christian judgment. By the late 1600s, the golden age of Jesuit mission work in New France was fading. Wars, disease, and colonial expansion had fractured many indigenous societies. Some Christian villages survived, but the grand dream of a fully Christianized native population never materialized. Still, the Jesuits had left their mark. In the minds of converts, in the scrolls of history, and in the colonial structure of Quebec itself, the Jesuit story is one of faith and failure, of cultural exchange and cultural erasure. It's a reminder that an empire is never built by sword alone, but often by cross, word, and ink. If religion was the soul of New France, fur was its lifeblood. In the vast, untamed wilderness of Canada, where royal decrees mattered less than the change of seasons, a different kind of empire was being built. One driven not by conquest or colonization in the traditional sense, but by commerce, alliance, and the unpredictable flow of beaver pelts. By the mid-1600s, demand for beaver fur in Europe had reached a fever pitch. Felt hats, fashionable, durable, and water-resistant, were all the rage from Paris to London. And the best pelts came from the cold forests of North America, where thick-coated beavers thrived in countless lakes and rivers. The French, realizing this, transformed New France from a struggling colony into a fur-trading juggernaut. At the heart of this empire was a complex web of alliances with indigenous nations. The French had neither the numbers nor the knowledge to hunt, trap, and transport furs themselves. Instead, they relied on indigenous expertise, particularly that of the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Montagnais, and later the Odawa and Ojibwe. These groups became the essential intermediaries, exchanging beaver pelts for French goods, metal tools, textiles, firearms, glass beads, alcohol, and brass kettles. This partnership wasn't just economic, it was political. Gift-giving, intermarriage, and adoption were all part of the diplomatic rituals that bound the French to their native allies. The Coureurs de Bois, independent French traders, ventured deep into the interior, sometimes disappearing into indigenous communities for months or years at a time. Many took native wives, learned indigenous languages, and lived more like their trading partners than their European superiors. Over time, these alliances pushed the French further inland. From the St. Lawrence Valley, explorers and traders expanded into the Great Lakes region, building outposts at places like Trois-Rivières, Montreal, and later Detroit. They traveled by birch bark canoe along ancient water routes, setting up trading posts and forts. Half marketplace, half military station, the French model was different from that of the English or Spanish. Where others sought to claim land, impose rigid colonial systems, and displace indigenous populations, the French aimed to integrate, to turn indigenous nations into partners, not subjects. It was a pragmatic choice born out of necessity. But it also created a unique frontier culture, a fusion of French and native customs that blurred the lines of race, language, and power. Still, the fur trade was not without its costs. The influx of European goods and weapons destabilized indigenous politics. Nations that had once coexisted were now drawn into deadly rivalries over trade routes and access to French partners. The Iroquois Confederacy, once weakened by disease, re-emerged with firearms from Dutch and English traders, and began to attack French allies in the Beaver Wars of the mid-17th century. These wars devastated the Huron, forced mass migrations, and turned large swaths of the interior into war zones. Moreover, overhunting began to take its toll. Beaver populations declined near major trading hubs, pushing indigenous trappers further west in search of new territories. This set the stage for French expansion deep into the continent, eventually reaching the Mississippi River and forming early ties with peoples like the Illinois, Sioux, and Mandan. In 1670, French explorer Louis Joliet and Jesuit priest Jacques Marquette embarked on an ambitious journey to map the Mississippi. They were not searching for land to colonize, but for rivers to trade, nations to befriend, and routes to Spanish silver. Their voyage marked the beginning of France's westward vision, a vision that would one day reach Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. Yet the farther the French pushed, the more fragile their empire became. Distance made control difficult. The central authority in Quebec and Montreal was often out of touch with realities on the ground. Independent traders, driven by profit rather than policy, sometimes undermined royal edicts. The line between ally and subject, friend and foe, became harder to define. And while the fur trade brought wealth, it did not bring stability. As indigenous nations became more dependent on European goods, their own economies and traditions shifted. Hunting patterns changed. Family roles evolved. Entire generations grew up navigating two worlds, neither fully indigenous nor fully European. By the late 1600s, France had built a vast trading empire that stretched from the icy shores of Hudson Bay to the warm banks of the Mississippi. But it was an empire of cooperation, not domination, of rivers and canoes, not walls and cities. Its strength lay not in numbers or guns, but in relationships, delicate, negotiated, and always at risk of unraveling. The fur trade had made New France a player on the global stage, but it had also tethered its fate to the decisions, alliances, and survival of the indigenous peoples who truly held the keys to the continent. And as we shall see in the chapters ahead, those relationships, though powerful, would be tested by empires, war, and the relentless pull of empire. In the vast, untamed wilderness of 17th century North America, France's fur empire stretched elegantly through rivers, forests, and native alliances. But as French explorers paddled westward and indigenous partners traded pelts for muskets and metal, another empire was rising in the east. An empire that didn't want to trade, but to conquer. That rival was England, and it was coming not with canoes and Jesuits, but with settlers, ships, and an insatiable hunger for land. By the mid-1600s, the English colonies of Virginia, Massachusetts, and Maryland had established a foothold on the Atlantic seaboard. Unlike New France, whose population barely scratched 10,000, England was sending waves of colonists across the Atlantic. Tens of thousands of Englishmen and women arrived with land grants and Protestant Bibles in hand, determined to build permanent, self-sustaining settlements. And unlike the French, who relied on fragile indigenous alliances, the English were displacing the very people they encountered. The English weren't just colonists, they were competitors. Their colonies soon became economic engines, producing tobacco, rice, and sugar, and trading directly with Europe and the Caribbean. English ships patrolled the coast, and merchants looked north and west at France's wilderness empire with greedy eyes. The two nations, old enemies in Europe, were now on a collision course in the New World. The first central pressure point emerged in the north, with the creation of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670. This chartered company, granted sweeping monopoly rights by King Charles II, aimed to control the fur trade from the Hudson Bay region, territory that overlapped with French ambitions. The English built forts at Rupert House, Moose Factory, and York Factory, offering indigenous trappers better prices, more goods, and a quicker route to the Atlantic than the long haul to Montreal or Quebec. It was a brilliant strategy. Cut out the French intermediaries and dominate the trade from the north. France was incensed. From their perspective, the English were trespassing on New France's northern frontier, undermining alliances, and turning indigenous groups into pawns of imperial games. What followed was a Cold War of the wilderness, a series of raids, seizures, and shifting tribal allegiances that would ignite into open conflict. Meanwhile, in the South, the English posed a different kind of threat. Colonies like New York, captured from the Dutch, and the Carolinas were expanding inland. They brought with them a more aggressive attitude toward indigenous peoples, pushing tribes westward and inflaming old rivalries. Some indigenous nations, like the Iroquois Confederacy, began to play both sides, trading with the English while manipulating French dependence on native alliances. The Iroquois, once nearly destroyed by disease, had re-emerged as a regional power, armed with English muskets and eager to dominate the fur trade. To the French, the Iroquois were a recurring nightmare. Their raids on Huron and Algonquin allies disrupted supply lines and threatened the very fabric of New France's empire. Missionaries were killed, villages were burned, and the French were forced to build fortifications deeper in the interior, not just against Native Americans' attacks, but to hold back English influence. This tense rivalry climaxed in a series of global wars that spilled into North America. The 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, known in the colonies as King William's War. It was the first of several conflicts between France and England that would turn North America into a brutal extension of European geopolitics. During this war, French forces from Quebec launched daring raids into New England settlements. In one infamous attack in 1690, the French and their native allies burned the English town of Schenectady, New York, to the ground. Men, women, and children slaughtered in their sleep. But retaliation came swiftly. English colonial militias, backed by royal troops and privateers, struck back along the coast, blockading French shipping and threatening Quebec itself. It was clear, New France was no longer an isolated fur outpost. It was a battleground of empires. By the end of the century, France was ringed by enemies. To the north, the English controlled the Hudson Bay. To the east, English colonies crept closer to the St. Lawrence. To the south, the Carolinas and Georgia funneled more trade, more settlers, and more violence into native territory. France's survival now hinged on three fragile threads. 1. Control of the rivers, the arteries of commerce and transport. 2. Loyalty of indigenous allies, increasingly tempted by English trade. 3. Support from the French crown, which was often distracted by European wars. The fur trade had made New France rich, but it had also made it vulnerable. As England's colonies grew bolder, larger, and more populous, the French knew that conflict was not a possibility. It was inevitable. The struggle for North America had begun, not just between two empires, but between two visions of colonization, one based on alliance and adaptation, the other on conquest and domination. And as the 18th century approached, that struggle would erupt into a war that would determine the fate of the entire continent. As the struggle for dominance in North America intensified, France did not fight with swords and muskets alone. It also waged a war of the soul, carried across the rivers and forests of New France by a group of black-robed men known as the Jesuits. Founded in 1540, the Society of Jesus was a Catholic order of missionaries, scholars, and educators, tasked with spreading the gospel and defending the church against the rising tide of Protestantism. By the 1600s, the Jesuits had become the intellectual and spiritual elite of Catholic Europe. And in New France, they saw not just a land of opportunity, but a spiritual battlefield, a frontier where eternal souls were at stake. Beginning in the 1620s and 1630s, Jesuit missionaries arrived in Canada with a singular mission: convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity. They traveled not to the French settlements, but into the heart of the continent, into the longhouses of the Huron, the forests of the Algonquin, the winter camps of the Montagnais. They learned the languages, adopted the diets, endured the brutal cold and hunger, and in many cases, died trying. They were known simply as the Black Robes. At the center of their efforts was the Huron Mission, a vast network of Jesuit outposts established in the territory of the Wendat Confederacy near Georgian Bay. There, men like Jean de Brebeuf, Isaac Jogues, and Gabriel Lalemant lived among the Huron for years, documenting their language, culture, and spiritual beliefs while preaching the message of Christ. They brought with them Bibles, crosses, and European medicine, but also smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases that decimated the very people they sought to save. Invisible plagues emptied entire villages. The Huron population, once numbering in the tens of thousands, collapsed in a matter of decades. Still, the Jesuits persisted, believing suffering purified the spirit. They saw martyrdom not as failure, but as triumph. And martyrdom came. In the 1640s, as the Iroquois Confederacy, now armed and emboldened by trade with the English and Dutch, escalated its attacks on Huron territory, the Jesuits found themselves in the path of destruction. They did not flee. When Brebeuf and Lalemant were captured by Iroquois warriors in 1649, they were tortured to death with hot coals, knives, and boiling water. Their deaths were horrific, but to the Jesuits back in Europe, they became legends, symbols of holy sacrifice. Their stories were published in France in the annual Jesuit Relations, letters sent home by missionaries detailing their efforts and challenges. These volumes became bestsellers, igniting curiosity and religious fervor across Europe. The wilderness of Canada was no longer just a trading zone. It was a sacred space, a crucible of divine testing. But the missions were not without controversy. To many Indigenous people, the Jesuits were disruptive and strange. Their refusal to participate in traditional ceremonies, their rejection of native spirituality, their push for European-style monogamy and gender roles, all of it clashed with deeply held cultural norms. Some Huron chiefs welcomed the Jesuits as allies, hoping the French God would protect them from disease or defeat. Others blamed them for the epidemics, the droughts, and the breakdown of traditional order. In more than one village, Jesuits were attacked, expelled, or shunned. Still, the missionaries kept coming. By the late 1600s, Jesuit missions had expanded deep into the interior, into the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes, and even as far south as Louisiana. Alongside explorers like Jacques Marquette, Jesuit priests mapped rivers, wrote dictionaries of indigenous languages, and baptized thousands. They were not always successful, and many converts continued to practice native traditions in secret. But they left an undeniable imprint, the birth of a hybrid spiritual world, where Catholic saints and native spirits shared space in the same cosmology. The Jesuit legacy also shaped the political strategy of New France. Unlike the English, who often dismissed indigenous culture as savage or disposable, the French, thanks in part to Jesuit efforts, saw their native allies as partners, even potential Frenchmen. Baptized indigenous people were granted legal rights. Mixed-race marriages were encouraged in some settlements. Christianity, for all its colonial power, also created bridges between worlds. But those bridges were fragile. As imperial wars raged and France struggled to maintain control, the missions came under increasing pressure. The Crown began to prioritize military strategy and trade over spiritual outreach, leading to a drying up of funding for missions. And younger generations of indigenous people, watching their communities torn by disease and war, became less receptive to Christian teachings. By the early 18th century, the Jesuit Golden Age in New France was fading. Yet their legacy remained. The Black Robes had shaped the heart of the colony, not just its soul, but its identity. They had baptized chiefs and chronicled civilizations. They had died in snow-covered forests, whispering prayers in Wendat and Algonquin tongues. And they had built a myth, the myth of New France as not merely a colony, but a Catholic mission to the New World. A myth that would endure even as the empire around it began to fracture. By the early 1700s, the dream of New France had grown bold, but brittle. A vast territory stretched from the frozen banks of Quebec to the warm deltas of Louisiana, connected by rivers, outposts, and fragile promises. On maps, it looked like an empire. On the ground, it was a patchwork stitched together by alliances, fur, faith, and fear. That fear came from the east. The English colonies, once clinging to the Atlantic coast, had begun to grow, and grow fast. While French Canada had just a few thousand settlers by the early 18th century, the English boasted hundreds of thousands. Their towns multiplied. Their ports thrived. Their hunger for land became insatiable. And land was the problem. The French had long relied on diplomacy with native nations to hold their territory. They didn't build sprawling farms. They built forts, nodes of trade, military presence, and spiritual outreach. These were the skeleton of New France: Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, Fort Detroit in the west, Fort Michilimackinac on the Straits. Each was a bead in a rosary of empire. But to the British, these forts looked like provocations and provable threats. As the 1700s wore on, both sides began to expand into the Ohio Valley, a region rich in trade, rivers, and strategic value. The French claimed it by exploration, while the English claimed it by royal charter and commercial appetite. Native nations like the Shawnee, Delaware, and Iroquois found themselves caught in the crosshairs, courted, coerced, or crushed, depending on the shifting winds of diplomacy. To hold the line, France fortified its defenses. In 1717, Fort Niagara was reinforced near the mouth of the Niagara River. In the 1720s, Fort Chambly and Fort Carillon, later known as Ticonderoga, bristled with cannon and stone. These were not humble outposts. They were statements, bold declarations that the heart of the continent belonged to the French. But England was doing the same. Colonial militias were raised, charters were granted, and in 1749, the British established the Ohio Company, a land speculation venture meant to claim French-held areas. That same year, a French expedition buried lead plates along the Ohio River, literally staking the land for King Louis XV. It was a game of chess in the wilderness, and both sides were moving their knights forward. Meanwhile, France was undergoing internal strain. Back home, wars with other European powers drained the royal treasury. The crown struggled to fund the military and colonial administration. Governors in Quebec sent desperate pleas for reinforcements, muskets, and men. But Versailles responded slowly, if at all. At the same time, the indigenous alliances that once sustained New France began to fracture. The Iroquois Confederacy, long the dominant native force in the Northeast, played the French and British against each other. But as epidemics and war wore down their power, younger native leaders grew skeptical of European promises. Some turned away, others chose sides, and some waited, watching the storm build. The most symbolic flashpoint of this growing tension came in Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia. Here, a small but stubborn French Catholic population clung to their homes amid an increasingly Protestant, British-occupied world. After the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Britain claimed the region, but the French inhabitants, called Acadians, refused to swear loyalty to the British crown. British suspicion turned to resentment, resentment to paranoia. In response, the French constructed Fort Beauséjour near the border. The British answered with Fort Lawrence. A Cold War settled over the marshes and tides of Nova Scotia. A single musket shot could ignite it all. And in 1754, it did. Deep in the Ohio Valley, a young British officer named George Washington ambushed a French scouting party near present-day Pittsburgh. The clash was minor. The consequences were world-changing. The French and Indian War had begun, a global conflict that would decide the fate of empires. But before the guns thundered across continents, there was a quiet sense of inevitability. Everyone knew the tension had reached a boiling point. The forts, the maps, the rivalries. They weren't just about territory. They were about worldviews. France believed in an empire of rivers and alliances, built on fur and faith. Britain believed in land, farms, families, and unfettered growth. These visions could not coexist forever. As New France braced for impact, its people, French settlers, indigenous allies, Jesuit priests, fur traders, and soldiers, stood at the edge of history. The seeds had been planted, the soil was cracked, and the storm was coming. New France had always been a vision more than a reality, a shimmering thread of waterways, fur roots, and fragile alliances stitched across a vast and indifferent wilderness. But by the mid-17th century, that vision was unraveling fast. The year was 1754. The Ohio Valley, long a contested and fertile region, had become the spark in a powder keg. France had fortified the area with a new bastion, Fort Duquesne, at the meeting point of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. This wasn't just a trading post, it was a line in the sand. And when a young British officer named George Washington attempted to challenge it, his failure marked the beginning of a storm that would engulf the world. This was no longer a skirmish in the woods. It was the opening act of the French and Indian War, the North American front of a global conflict that would soon be called the 7 Years' War. New France, already stretched thin, was now pulled into a battle it was ill-prepared to fight. The colony's greatest strength, its network of forts and indigenous alliances, was also its greatest weakness. While British colonies boasted local militias, thriving economies, and booming populations, New France depended heavily on support from across the Atlantic. And Versailles was distracted. France, embroiled in wars across Europe and facing financial ruin, sent too little, too late. Meanwhile, the British were mobilizing like never before. Colonial assemblies raised regiments. Naval ships blockaded French ports. And from Massachusetts to Virginia, the desire to expel France from North America entirely became a rallying cry. Indigenous alliances began to shift. Tribes once loyal to France, like the Huron and the Algonquin, found their lands burning in the crossfire. Some doubled down on their partnerships with the French, hoping for protection. Others began to defect, tired of broken promises and defeat. The balance of power was tilting. And then came the Acadian tragedy, a scar on the history of the empire. In 1755, British authorities began forcibly removing French Catholic settlers from Acadia. Families were torn apart. Churches were burned. Entire communities were put on ships and scattered from Louisiana to the Caribbean. Some would become the roots of Cajun culture. Others would never see home again. The message was clear. Coexistence was over. Back in the heart of New France, Quebec and Montreal stood defiant, but isolated. The mighty St. Lawrence River, once a lifeline, was now a corridor of vulnerability. British forces, inching closer, understood that if the river fell, the colony would collapse. In 1758, the British launched a decisive campaign. Louisbourg, the fortress guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence, was captured after a brutal siege. This opened the door to the Canadian interior. The following year, General James Wolfe led a force up the river to take the heart of French power, Quebec City. The battle came on the Plains of Abraham, a windswept field outside the city's walls. It lasted less than an hour. Wolfe was killed. So was the French commander, Marquis de Montcalm. But the British won. Quebec fell. And with it, the dream of New France began to die. By 1760, Montreal surrendered. French troops laid down their arms. The colonial elite packed their things. And the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, confirmed it all. France had lost Canada, but in that loss, something more profound had occurred. The fall of New France wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of a worldview, an empire built not on plantations or masses of settlers, but on rivers, native diplomacy, and the fragile links of trade and faith. It was a model of empire that had once seemed viable, even enlightened. But it could not compete with the relentless expansion, demographic weight, and military might of Britain's Atlantic colonies. Still, New France did not vanish entirely. Its people, French Canadians, Acadians, Métis, and indigenous partners, endured. They adapted. They resisted. The language survived. So did the Catholic faith. So did the memory. In the end, the French did not lose North America in a single battle or decision. They lost it in a slow erosion of resources, diplomacy, and resolve. And yet, their imprint remained, etched into names, cultures, rivers, and scars. The fall of New France was not just the end of one empire, it was the beginning of another. Because as British rule spread and American ambition stirred, the seeds were planted for a new chapter in history, one that would soon explode into revolution. And Quebec, once the jewel of New France, would become the front line in the battle for the soul of a continent.